Welcome to Homerun For Julian. This is a series of events, rallies, forums conducted on behalf of the founder of WikiLeaks, Julian Assange. This afternoon we have a set of panelists, including John and Gabriel Shipton, Julian Assange's father and brother. But before we begin the program, I would like to acknowledge that this country, the United States, that we all know its culture, its economy, its development, we would like to acknowledge the land and the stolen labor of the people that, if not for their sacrifices, this country would not exist. We are live streaming to you from Los Angeles, California, the traditional and ancestral home of the Tongva people. I would like to just take a moment to acknowledge their sacrifice. Thank you. My name is Sharon. I am the publisher of the LA Progressive, as well as a member of the Los Angeles branch of the Assange Defense Committee. Today we're going to be talking to Stephen Rohde, who is also a member of the Los Angeles branch of the Assange Committee, as well as Marjorie Cohn. And in the center here, we have John Shipton, who is Julian Assange's father, and Gabriel Shipton, Julian Assange's brother. And at the end, we have Jody Armour, also a member of the LA branch of the Assange Defense Committee, and an attorney and a law professor at USC. We're going to begin our questioning at this end of the table, and I'll start by questioning Steve Rohde. And Steve, if you'd like to add any information about yourself, please feel free to do so. But first, we'd like to know if you could give us an overview. Why is Assange charged with, and what is he charged with, and what are the ramifications of these charges for the rest of us?
Thank you, Sharon. Thanks, everybody who's watching this event. It is a near culmination of a nationwide tour that John and Gabriel Shipton have been conducting over the last several weeks to bring attention to the human rights injustices surrounding the prosecution and incarceration of Julian Assange. This is, in my opinion, in the current atmosphere, the worst example of an attempt to repress freedom of the press in this country in modern times. As a First Amendment lawyer, a writer, a student of the First Amendment, I've looked back over the history of the United States, which has been stained by examples when those in power have exercised that power contrary to our Constitution, contrary to the First Amendment, and contrary to principles of international law and human decency. And the prosecution, incarceration, and torture of Julian Assange is a prime current example of that. I think unless the U.S. government does the right thing, if Julian Assange remains in prison, if he is ever extradited to the United States to stand charges, this will be one of the gravest injuries to the U.S. Constitution and to international law in our lifetimes. I am not prone to exaggeration, but I believe everything I just said. Many of you know the history of WikiLeaks, this extraordinary revolution in being able to present information to the people of the world on important issues and as a matter of public interest. Julian Assange, as the founder of WikiLeaks, launched an amazing public service which has exposed wrongdoing and corruption across the world. But when he tackled with the United States of America in 2010, in releasing leaked documents regarding U.S. war crimes, and perhaps most brutally, a video that had become known now as collateral murder, showing the actual footage of U.S. helicopters killing innocent people, the U.S. took notice of Julian Assange. In the Obama administration, they considered indicting Julian Assange under the U.S. Espionage Act of 1917. This is an ominous law passed during the early Red Scare in the United States. It is on the books in an effort to purportedly punish spies and other figures. But it is so broad, and as it's been used in the Assange case, it is so dangerous in sweeping within its provisions the indictment, in this case, of a world-renowned journalist. The Obama administration thought twice. They faced what is known now as the New York Times problem. If we indict Julian Assange as a publisher and a journalist of released information, how can we not indict the New York Times and other publishers and journalists who release leaked information as part and parcel of their national security coverage? Consequently, the Obama administration did not indict Julian Assange. Then we moved into the Trump era, and the Trump Department of Justice did indict Julian Assange, eventually on 17 counts under the Espionage Act and 1 count under a computer hacking charge. Today, Julian Assange faces 175 years in prison. I've spoken and organized and campaigned for the release of Julian Assange for years now, but I've never done it sitting at a table with his loved ones, his father John and his brother Gabriel. It almost catches in my throat to describe the potential punishment that Julian Assange faces and to say those words in your presence, John and Gabriel, because it has never been more stark, it has never been more ominous to think that the son and brother of these two men faces those kinds of charges. The U.S. government moved to extradite Julian Assange, who had for years sought safe haven in the Ecuadorian embassy. But through a change of government and policy, he was expelled, and on the steps of the Ecuadorian embassy, he was seized by British police and incarcerated in the Belmarsh legendary, horrible prison, where he remains to the moment that you are hearing my voice. The U.S. government aggressively moved against Assange to have him extradited to the United States of America. Public hearings were held, and many of us weighed in, as did others. Witnesses testified to the contributions that Julian Assange made to freedom of the press and to public policy across the world. Others testified to how dangerous a precedent this would be to freedom of the press for Julian Assange to be extradited, prosecuted, and convicted. At the conclusion of those hearings, Judge Vanessa Baraitser, on January 4 of this year, offered a mixed opinion in her extradition decision. As a bottom line, she denied the U.S. extradition of Julian Assange. She did so on humanitarian grounds that the risk of, and again I pause to say this in John and Gabriel's presence, the risk of Julian's suicide was documented and too great to justify extraditing him to the United States. On those limited grounds, she denied extradition. However, she went out of her way in the rest of her written opinion to deny Julian and his lawyers' defenses based on the public offense exception to extradition that exists under British law, which says that political figures cannot be extradited for political reasons. And if you ever saw a prosecution more political in its motivation, it is the Assange prosecution. She denied his lawyer's arguments that that extradition would pose a risk to freedom of the press. Those are dangerous time bombs sitting in the midst of her written opinion. Under the Trump administration, the ruling was appealed. And unfortunately, in the early days of the Joe Biden administration, currently the Department of Justice is pursuing the appeal from the denial of extradition of Julian Assange. This is an outrage from an administration that purports to hold progressive values that are dedicated to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And when we come to a call of action at the end of this program, we'll be calling on you to reach out to the Department of Justice, to reach out to the Biden administration and to all of your elected officials. This is the time to drop the prosecution and persecution of Julian Assange. Accept the ruling that he should not be extradited. Let that case rest. Let him be released. Let him return to these family members, to his wife, and to his children. Let him try to restore his health and his life. That is what the demands of human rights call for. That's what the demands of the U.S. Constitution call for. And I hope every one of you is committed to that goal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. So now, it's clear that this committee is calling for the immediate release of Julian Assange, but I want to ask Marjorie, particularly for those who are watching this live stream, who don't understand why WikiLeaks and the disclosure that happened in 2010 was so important. Why is it important, and why did Chelsea Manning leak?
Yes, and I first want to echo Steve's comments about what an honor it is to be sitting here with the brother and father of Julian Assange, and my heart goes out to you and your family for what you have gone through, and particularly what Julian has gone through. And I am a retired law professor, former president of the National Lawyers Guild, and very proud to be working with the Julian defense, Assange defense committee. As Steve mentioned, the reason that Julian Assange is being persecuted and prosecuted is because he had the gall, he had the temerity to reveal evidence of U.S. war crimes. And this was a step too far for the U.S. government. They just could not abide that. So what exactly did Julian Assange and WikiLeaks publish? Well, they published 90,000 reports about the war in Afghanistan. They're called the Afghan War Logs, and they documented a greater number of civilian casualties by coalition forces than the U.S. military had reported. In addition, WikiLeaks published nearly 400,000 field reports about the Iraq War, more than 15,000 unreported deaths of Iraqi civilians, and the systematic murder, torture, and rape by the Iraqi army and authorities that were ignored by U.S. forces. WikiLeaks also published the Guantanamo files, 779 secret reports containing evidence of the U.S. government's abuse of approximately 800 men and boys ages 14 to 89 in violation of the Geneva Conventions and the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. But perhaps the most notorious release, which Steve referred to, was the 2007 collateral murder video, which depicts a U.S. Army Apache helicopter target and fire on unarmed civilians in Baghdad. At least 18 civilians were killed, including 2 Reuters reporters and a man who came to the rescue of the wounded. 2 children were injured, and a U.S. Army tank drove over one of the bodies, severing it in two. These actions are evidence of 3 separate war crimes under the Geneva Conventions. And one of the things that is rarely mentioned is that the revelations by Julian Assange and WikiLeaks actually saved lives, because when Obama was negotiating with the Iraqi government to withdraw U.S. troops from Iraq, the Iraqi government, having seen the war crimes that were revealed by WikiLeaks, refused to grant immunity to U.S. soldiers for civil and criminal activities that they might engage in Iraq. And so Obama was forced to withdraw more troops from Iraq, which actually saved lives. Now, Chelsea Manning, of course, revealed this evidence to WikiLeaks in 2010, and she was frustrated by her inability to convince her chain of command to investigate the collateral murder video and what she referred to as war porn. She was troubled by the soldiers in the collateral murder video who referred to their targets as dead bastards. She thought that her revelations, that these revelations, could spark a domestic debate on the role of the military and U.S. foreign policy in Iraq and Afghanistan and its effects on the people living there. Now, if publication of national security secrets violates the Espionage Act, we would not know about governmental misconduct in the so-called War on Terror. The Washington Post's expose of the CIA black sites, the torture and abuse of prisoners in Afghanistan and Iraq that the New Yorker and 60 Minutes 2 disclosed, and the warrantless surveillance program revealed by the New York Times. As Noam Chomsky, who is one of the co-chairs of the National Assange Defense Committee, pointed out, the government always invokes national security when it doesn't want people to know what they're doing in their name. And he added that national security really means the security of the state against its own citizens. So I join with Steve and the other people on this panel and people all over the world in calling for the immediate dismissal of the appeal by the U.S. government of the denial of extradition and the immediate release of Julian Assange. Thank you.
Thank you, Marjorie. So now we're going to go on and talk a little bit to Professor Jody Armour, who is seated at the other end of the table, and I just want people to understand we're not skipping over John and Gabriel. They're going to give us their impression of this tour of the United States. They've been touring for about a month now, over a dozen cities, and so we're going to be talking a little bit about that. But before we do, I wanted to ask Jody, if extradited to the United States, Assange faces potential life sentence, effectively solitary confinement in a supermax prison. Can you put Assange's perspective in context of how the U.S. treats political dissidents?
Yeah, well, torture is what Amnesty International calls solitary confinement for over a very limited period of time. A matter of days. And so you have people who are now in torturous conditions, literally, not figuratively, and they're being tortured for not doing anything that the New York Times wouldn't or couldn't or shouldn't have done under similar circumstances. So they're being tortured by the state, putting their blood on our collective hands, their pain and suffering on our collective hands for no good reason. If there were a good reason, Derek Chauvin just got a very stiff sentence because he kneeled on a man's neck for 9.5 minutes while he was gasping for breath. That's a clear wrong, right? Here we have something that isn't even a wrong, that it was a right that actually shed light on something that needed light shed on it, because we all know, as they say rightly, that democracy dies in the dark. Justice dies in the dark. A lot of journalists like Gary Webb, I'm writing a book now on Gary Webb and the way he's exposed the corruption in the CIA at the highest level to the devastation of the black community. You know, we're talking about George Floyd, the generational upheaval we saw over last summer. That was a reckoning that was made possible by journalists. A lot of great journalism went into our seeing what really is going on with systemic racism in this country. So you have someone who is not committing a wrong worthy of even a misdemeanor, who is looking at being tortured by the state, and for that reason alone we should, if for no other, and there are lots of others that I'll go into hopefully later, but for that reason alone we should soundly reject what is a clear political persecution. You know, if someone's doing something that you can't differentiate from really the New York Times, then the exercise of discretion is to settle political scores. It's not to get at any, you know, real legal wrong. And unless we have a common truth, we can't have a common purpose, and our common truth is going to come from our journalists, from our fearless journalists, and this is going to have a chilling effect on journalists. You know, you can even look at someone like Darnella Frazier, who recorded Derek Chauvin. That's a kind of street-level journalist, right? The government can come at, and has gone after some of our street-level journalists. This can have a chilling effect that runs broad, and it's very disturbing, and we need to do something to lift up Julian Assange's name in the way it needs to be lifted up, and resist this injustice.
Thank you, Jody, for bringing light to the broader ramifications of what this can mean to all of us. And having said that, and speaking of all of us here in the United States, now I'd like to go to Gabriel and ask, so you've been on tour for several weeks. I don't even know how you can still be awake. I'd like to know, what is your impression of the United States and how well you've been received? Tell us about some of those experiences on this tour and why you thought it was important to come here.
We've been here since the beginning of June. I think we've been to 15 cities across the country. We started off in Miami, and then did a bit of the East Coast with New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Washington DC, and then we made our way west through Columbus, Milwaukee, Chicago, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Denver, and Oakland. I think I got them all. Oakland, Oakland, and then down here to LA, and then we're going to finish off, with all the momentum we built up in DC. We're heading there tomorrow. From the outset, just the amount of, this upwelling of support that we've seen, it's taken our breaths away, really. I mean, as a member of Julian's family, a lot of the, the prosecution originates here. A lot of the sort of negativity around Julian originates from the US. So definitely come here with this perception that we're not going to be met with open arms and we're not going to find support. But it's been an absolute complete opposite. Normal Americans are coming out to say, we support Julian, we see that this prosecution is an assault on the First Amendment, an assault on the free press, and they're really concerned about that, and they're coming out to listen to us talk about it, which is a bit weird because, we're Australian from America, but we're able to sort of raise it and get people together to talk about this issue, which is really important at the moment. And then what else is we've been seeing is sort of this, following this this upwelling of support from people has followed media support. So we've seen, I think it's almost 30 articles now since we arrived in you know, a variety of different publications. Your radio shows, everywhere we go, we're doing radio shows, you know, over 20 radio shows, local radio shows, doing interviews, talking about the First Amendment implications of Julian's prosecution. We've been on, you know, just today we're on MSNBC, we've been on Tucker Carlson, Amy Goodman, Democracy Now! And Fox News. You know, that's often, you know, one of the strange things is that Tucker Carlson and Amy Goodman both agree that this case is a danger to the First Amendment. So it's this sort of the First Amendment is overarching and encompasses all political views. So really, you know, everybody should be out there, you know, standing up for their First Amendment rights, and by doing so, freeing Julian.
Thank you so much, Gabe. So, John, as a parent, I can't even imagine how difficult this is for you. Could you tell us a little bit about how Julian is doing right now?
Well, these tours, this is our fifth one. This is the biggest one. Reporting back, many friends of Julian's who have visited him in the embassy over the years have housed us, have made themselves known. Yesterday, Mia, missing in action, pop star, called by and said hello. She's a friend of Julian's. So that circumstance has repeated itself many times over. So that lifts spirits to think that when you're in a jail cell, which is maybe 10 feet by 8 feet, and your toilet's in the corner, and you're in there 23 hours a day, reaching out emotionally and imaginatively into the world, and that world returns your curiosity and care in saying that they are with you, they care for you. This lifts the spirit and keeps you alive, as you can imagine. Just some general comments that I could divide into three, so that the other speakers may be stimulated or interested in. Julian moves towards his 13th year in arbitrary detention, 3rd year in the Belmarsh maximum security prison. Arbitrary detention. In 2017, the United Nations Working Committee on Arbitrary Detention determined that Julian was arbitrarily detained and requested that the United Kingdom and the Sweden release Julian and pay him compensation. 2018 February, they followed up with a subsidiary report stating even more firmer language, the same thing. The United Kingdom appealed, and those appeals were dismissed. That's the United Nations. A little later, the United Nations Rapporteur on Torture, Professor of Law at Glasgow University, Nils Melzer, interviewed Julian in the Belmarsh prison with 2 experts on psychological torture, and in a 36-page exacting report determined that Julian was a victim of psychological torture which consisted of calumnies, mobbing, lies, smears, malfeasance and misfeasance, the breaking of all of the requirements of due process and irregularities in process. 36 pages of it. He then sent a subsidiary conclusion report to the Swedish government, who had been involved, the Swedish prosecuting authority, involved in a conspiracy with the Crown Prosecuting Service. Now, this is documented with FOIs. Niels Ladefog and myself went to Gothenburg and picked up 5,127 pages of FOI releases documenting this, what I'm saying now, what I'm about to say. Stefania Marizi's FOIs equally documented. Stefania had to take the data people in the United Kingdom to a court to get them to release what is rightfully ours. These demonstrated as follows: once the Crown Prosecuting Service and the Swedish Prosecuting Authority entered into a conspiracy to keep Julian in the embassy. That comes as a surprise to you, doesn't it? To keep Julian in the embassy. The Crown Prosecuting Service solicitor Paul Close, writing to Prosecutor Marianne Nye of the Swedish Prosecuting Authority, there's more to this than a simple extradition, you know. You're not getting cold feet, are you? It is our strong advice that you don't come to London and interview Julian or use the facilities of video to interview Julian under strict Swedish laws, but wait until until Julian's removed from the United Kingdom into Sweden. Documented, all of it. So the removal of Julian from the embassy contravened the laws and conventions of asylum which were established in 1958 and ratified by the United Nations General Assembly in 1973. Human rights legislation. In 1948, under the chairmanship of Eleanor Roosevelt, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was made. The establishment of the United Nations after the horrors of the Second World War and the First World War, established in order that states may negotiate their interests with each other through law, through a body of law which enabled interests to be negotiated and accommodated. The invasion of Iraq was what we now know as an illegal war. It was a declaration of war upon the Iraqi people, a modern war, where warfare is against the civilian population. I'll make that point over and over again. The warfare was against the civilian population, infrastructure bombed, electricity stations bombed, 365 women and children destroyed in a single blow by a tomahawk cruise missile aimed at the doorway of the bomb shelter. On and on it goes. Brown University released a report that the actions of the United States and its allies in the Middle East had created 36 million people seeking refugees. 36 million men, women and children seeking refuge around the world. There are many here and in my country and in Italy. 36 million. An Australian researcher, academic at Melbourne University, specialising in excess deaths calculations, Gideon Polya, calculates that 6 million excess deaths in the 20 years from the invasion of Iraq until his book was published last year. Equally, we have the horror of 7 countries destroyed in part or in whole. You can nominate them. Sudan and Syria, partially destroyed Pakistan, Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, on and on the list goes. What a rough beast. Its hour come round at last. Slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. Now, I mention these things not to burden the conscious and the consciences of the people of the United States. These are phenomenons of Washington. As we travel around the United States, we are received wholeheartedly and warmly and offered every sort of hospitality. I don't mention these things to burden the people of the United States. But the results have been of those magnificent releases. I'll come to that in a second. In around 1800, the Magna Carta was drawn up between the barons and the kings, inventing for the first time a shield of law between the people and the sovereign. The sovereign had to obey the law, and equally the people had to obey the law. In 1793, as a precipitate of that, and a deep understanding of Jefferson and others, they placed the Bill of Rights and that magnificent thing, the First Amendment, into the Constitution of the United States, enabling us, people of the United States and my country, to envy or get a deeper understanding that there's only one way, one road to freedom, and that's through knowledge. That's what that First Amendment contains and embraces us all. As a mother hen gathers its chickens underneath it, such is the quality of the First Amendment, a magnificent artifact of Western civilization. Next, those revelations that were brought to us by Chelsea Manning and WikiLeaks, the results have brought about, it's a very big thing to turn around a country as large and as powerful and as rich as the United States. It's no easy matter, but it's happened. Afghanistan, they're leaving. The never-ending wars are ending. Iraq, they're out of there, as Marilyn just showed us. Guantanamo Bay, it's being closed. Every person now is trying to, in Washington, is trying to close it, to work out a way to close it without bringing more shame onto the United States. That only has come about, in my view, as a phenomenon of enculturation rising up through the people of the United States as the knowledge of the actions of Washington percolates up and then precipitates down to cause Washington to reconsider its actions in one way or another without losing a sense of authority in the world or amongst its people. That's the blessings that those revelations brought to us by Chelsea Manning, who, if I could say so, I hold as an icon, the same way as one would hold Joan of Arc, Joan d'Arc, a historical figure of phenomenal importance, bringing to us those revelations which have managed to close a chapter in only 10 years of Washington's aggressions. And the last comment. The disgrace that the Department of Justice has brought to the administration of law in the United States over the manipulations of evidence and forcing the United Kingdom and the Swedish prosecuting authority. The disgrace that the Swedish prosecuting authority has brought upon itself in Sweden, as Sweden was once thought of as a model society, now only known as a purveyor of junk furniture. The United Kingdom, the invention of a shield of law between the people and the sovereign, disavowed in a careless, sadistic, malicious-filled show trial in September of Julian Assange, dismissing particular aspects of the treaty, the extradition treaty between the United States and the United Kingdom, which specifically says there will be no extraditions for political purposes. And I guess we all clearly understand that being charged with espionage is political. They brought shame upon themselves. Paul Craig Roberts states that the shame which stains the United States from the actions of the Department of Justice, ceaseless persecution, pursuing of Julian Assange, is indelible. I don't think it is, but he's an American of great moment, so I just offer that. But with the freeing of Julian, with the bringing home to his family of Julian, with the reinstatement of the qualities and the deliberations of the United States, of the United Nations, we are allowed once more to emerge and see the stars. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, John. At one point you said that you're not sharing this with us to burden our consciousness, but I think that we should all feel a sense of burden. What's happening to Julian Assange is a responsibility for all of us to take action, not just independent media, not just mainstream media, not just people that are in the media. Everyone should pay attention to what is happening here and take action. And at the end of this program, we're going to be sharing with you ways that you can do that. Before we get to that, I want to get back to Stephen Rohde and ask Stephen, just this week, and as a matter of fact, a couple of days ago, one of the U.S. government's main witnesses has admitted to outright lying about Julian Assange, now confessing that Assange never directed him to hack computers, never directed him to illegally get into websites. What could this mean for Assange's legal case?
Thank you. And before I explain that, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, John. Really. It is no mystery that the intelligence, the insight, the wisdom of your son was born by him knowing and loving his father. I am very, very moved by being with you today and hearing your words. It wasn't enough for the government to try to indict Julian Assange on these espionage charges, almost sensing a weakness in that aspect of their case. They added one charge of computer hacking. And to shore up that count, they made a deal with the devil in engaging a witness named Sigurdur Thordarson. And this is only a breaking news story of the last few days. I don't blame you if you're not familiar, but as a point of this program, please look up Mr. Thordarson. He has now admitted that as a witness for the United States government in the extradition proceedings in England, he lied about key details in his testimony that were used to place the WikiLeaks founder, Julian Assange, behind bars. In a international interview and story, which has just been published at Tundin, T-U-N-D-I-N, Thordarson admitted that the Department of Justice and the FBI gave him immunity from other crimes if he would help them set up Julian Assange. This is a dark and corrupt figure when you begin to learn about Mr. Thordarson. He had volunteered to work at WikiLeaks in 2010, insinuating himself into the organization. But it was later discovered that he had embezzled more than $50,000 from WikiLeaks during his time there. He regularly name-dropped WikiLeaks and made it appear that his role within the organization was more important than it actually was, according to these press reports. And he was contacted by federal agents with the United States government who gave him immunity for a variety of other crimes if he helped them build a case against Julian Assange. He ended up fabricating his entire testimony about Assange, making up a false story about how Assange had instructed him to hack government servers in order to obtain classified information. This worked very nicely into the government's theory of Julian Assange's alleged hacking with Chelsea Manning. This conversation, Thordarson now admits, never took place, and now Thordarson admits that he made it all up to get himself out of trouble. He's also provided chat logs proving that WikiLeaks had no clue that he was involved in any hacking, and the logs also proved that he actively deceived Assange and the rest of the team. Whistleblower Edward Snowden has recently said that this should end the case against Julian Assange. There is a principle in American law, which may have been borrowed from British law, that the errors of the constable and the errors of the judiciary and the errors of the prosecutor of this caliber disqualify a prosecution from going forward under fundamental principles of due process. If there were not enough grounds that we've begun to elucidate today for ending this prosecution of Julian Assange, I invoke the word that John used frequently, shame. Shame on the United States government if you do not step forward, admit that you were in bed and made an immunity deal with this witness, solicited his lies and used them against Julian Assange. And the shame should reach the British court, which should immediately dismiss the appeal on grounds of due process, because no court system that has been tricked by the introduction of corrupt testimony of this kind should tolerate such a thing. This is only one more reason of the lengths to which our U.S. government has gone. I'm ashamed of our government as I sit in the presence of these friends from Australia. I'm ashamed of this government for what it's done, and I hope everyone else is too.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Steve. So, Marjorie, so let's talk about the appeals process. Can you discuss the appeals process with us, and then go on and talk a little bit about the extradition hearing in London?
Yes, I just want to first follow up on what Steve was saying, this is the first time the U.S. government has prosecuted a journalist for revealing classified information. And so the U.S. government tried to show with this hacking charge that, well, Julian Assange is not really a journalist, he's a hacker, so that they could get around this problem, this New York Times problem, because Julian Assange and WikiLeaks did the same thing that the New York Times, the Washington Post, Der Spiegel, Le Monde, etc. did. And so they had to distinguish Julian Assange from journalism and call him a hacker. And with this recantation of this witness and admitting that he lied, that really drives a huge hole in the U.S. government's attempt to characterize Julian Assange as a hacker. In terms of the appeals, the U.S. government is appealing the judge's denial of extradition. And this is not an automatic appeal that will be heard by the higher appellate courts in Britain. This is discretionary, which means that the High Court and the Supreme Court in Britain have the discretion whether or not to even hear the appeal. And so if the High Court in Britain decides to hear the appeal and rules again against the U.S. government, in other words, affirms the judge's denial of extradition, then the U.S. government can appeal to the British Supreme Court. And once again, the U.S. government has no right to have their appeal heard by the Supreme Court. That also is discretionary, and the Supreme Court rarely hears appeals, only when there's a point of law of general public importance. So then, on a parallel track, we have the U.S. government. Well, if the Supreme Court, the High Court or the Supreme Court of Britain reverse the judge's decision and rule for the U.S. government, then Julian Assange has a right to appeal to the European Court of Human Rights, which is a regional court which protects the right of freedom of expression and prohibits torture, as has been stated here. Julian Assange has been subjected to torture for many years, psychological torture and solitary confinement, which amounts to torture. Arbitrary and unlawful detention, and discrimination in the enjoyment of the rights and freedoms protected by the European Court of Human Rights. This is not really an appeal from the Supreme Court of Britain. It's a parallel appeal, and again, it's discretionary. The European Court of Human Rights does not have the obligation to even hear the appeal. Now, in terms of the extradition hearing, witness after witness got up and testified about the threat to journalism, the threat to the First Amendment, the chilling effect that the prosecution of Julian Assange will have on national security journalism, investigative journalism. And so it's really important to understand that this case is much bigger than Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. It impacts all of journalism. It impacts the American public's right to know. And the journalists are a surrogate for the people. And there can be no democracy if there is no information. And also witness after witness testified, professionals, people who were familiar with the prison system in the United States, about what would happen if Julian Assange was extradited to the United States to be tried on this indictment. He would be housed in a top security prison where he would be subjected to solitary confinement for 23 hours a day, and special administrative measures, sometimes they're called SAMs, which are onerous conditions where he would be held in virtual isolation. And this, given his fragile emotional health, as a result of the years of psychological torture that he has undergone, would make him very vulnerable to suicide. And it's very important to note that the judge in Britain while she did not dispute the U.S. government's arguments that this is not really a question of the First Amendment and the right to journalists to do their job, she indicted the U.S. prison system. Her opinion is an incredible indictment of the U.S. prison system's inability to protect a prisoner like Julian Assange from committing suicide. So that's why Steve was talking about it as a mixed bag. Now, what the U.S. government will do if it is successful in overturning the British judge's denial of extradition and bringing him to the United States is to try him in the Eastern District of Virginia, the most conservative federal court in the country. That's where the so-called war on terror cases were prosecuted. And that and the tremendous media blitz from the corporate media, which will invariably come after Julian Assange, will make it very, very difficult, if not impossible, for Julian Assange to get a fair trial. So there are many, many reasons why this appeal should be dismissed by the Biden administration. And Joe Biden, who linked his coattails to Obama throughout the campaign, the presidential campaign, Barack and I this, Barack and I that. Well, Barack Obama, who prosecuted more whistleblowers under the Espionage Act than all other prior presidents combined, did not indict Julian Assange because of the New York Times problem. And so we need to remind Joe Biden about his buddy Barack and what Barack did or didn't do, which was to refrain from indicting Julian Assange under the Espionage Act.
Thank you so much, Marjorie. So, we're in a situation now where Julian Assange continues to be arbitrarily detained according to the words of the United Nations. And if the United States is successful, though, what we're looking at is Julian Assange coming to the United States and facing the U.S. prison system. So, Jody, I want to talk to you a bit about the U.S. prison system. You know a little bit about that. What do you think this says about the U.S. prison system that the request for extradition was denied?
Yeah, it's a damning indictment. And just before we get to that, I can't help but respond to some of the remarks we've already heard and again amplify what an injustice this is. I don't think a lot of Americans recognize what a gross injustice this is. But when you have people from Amy Goodman to Tucker Carlson stepping back and saying, you know, from given our very different political druthers, this doesn't smell right. When you have people characterizing someone as a hacker to try to solve the New York Times problem because it's not soluble, really. It's right. So you're going to reach. I feel bad as a law professor because I'm trying to tell my students there's such a thing in this country as the rule of law, right? But the rule of law would mean some constraints and limitations that wouldn't allow this to happen. It seems like you can exercise your discretion in flagrant disregard of the rule of law to, you know, make political hay because some uncomfortable truths about you were revealed. Rather than addressing those uncomfortable truths, let's do something with the messenger. And so the something we're doing, and that's what you get us to next, is we're going to put them in a situation where we're going to intentionally inflict upon them as much pain and suffering as possible. Because that's what solitary is. My dad was sentenced to 22 to 55 for possession and sale of marijuana. I used to go down to the prisons and look in some of the, he was in general population, but I'd go over there and look at some of the segregated units. And now as a law professor, I take my students into some of the segregated units. And we should be collectively disgraced, ashamed, and not tolerating this for anyone, especially not tolerating this for a person like Julian Assange, who has really rendered a very valuable service to us as a nation, to us as a planet, you know, and internationally. Actually, he's helped to reduce harm that otherwise would have been inflicted. And we so often, you know, here comes 4th of July, and we're going to talk a lot about freedom and celebrate our unity, but that's going to have a hollow ring if we don't do something now about this festering injustice that is this Julian Assange persecution.
Thank you, Jody. Now I want to return back to the Shiftons as we conclude this panel session. I would like to get a sense, and either one of you can talk about this, of your sense of our new Attorney General Merrick Garland. Do you have a sense of how he's looking at this case?
Yeah, I'll start off maybe. So I think, you know, since we've been here, there's been a bit of a, you know, some encouraging things happening within the DOJ. So Merrick Garland, these Trump-era subpoenas of journalists' records of their emails that were targeting people from the New York Times and CNN. Merrick Garland has started to pull those back and to stop that action from within the DOJ. So that's very encouraging that they're looking at these Trump-era prosecutions against journalists and winding those back. We've also seen, you know, Reality Winner is now out on good behaviour. So that's happened since we arrived here at the beginning of June. You know, that's very encouraging as well. There are some other things like maybe John could talk about the Computer Abuse and Fraud Act and how that's been constrained. It's been made less broad. That's from the Supreme Court. So there are all these actions that we're seeing from the DOJ where there is more consideration being put into freedom of the press. So we're hoping, you know, I think, you know, that we're encouraged by that and all this upwelling of support that we've seen, all this media, all feeds into that, feeds into the consciousness of the DOJ as well. Another phenomena that we've been seeing over the past 6 months is that, you know, as the State Department sort of confronts these overseas, you know, the sort of authoritarian states around the world, they're all faced with they have Julian Assange thrown back at them. So, you know, we've seen the Russian ambassador to the UK when he was questioned about Navalny and his treatment. He said, "Well, what about Assange? You've got a publisher locked up just down the road. You know, how can you confront us on Navalny?" When China's being confronted on their human rights and press freedoms, the Chinese Foreign Affairs spokesman said, you know, who are you to talk? Look what you're doing to Assange. You know, you've got a publisher locked in prison. Aliyev, who's the totalitarian leader of Azerbaijan, he was questioned, you know, on his record on press freedoms. You know, he's locked up journalists, he tortures journalists, and he was questioned about his record, and he said, "Well, who are you to ask me about my record when look what you're doing to a publisher and a journalist back in England?" So I think all these things, you know, they add up to make it, you know, very, very much easier for the Biden administration and for Merrick Garland to just let this prosecution go. They can, you know, the United States can sort of reclaim the moral high ground, and they can start, you know, walking the walk as well as talking the talk when it comes to press freedom. So I think yeah, we will see. I think there is a change happening, and there is this momentum that you know we've partly built up along with the people who we've met along the way that is going to make a difference.
Thank you, Gabriel. And So I'd like to leave the final remarks to you, John, before we move on and ask people to take action.
I just will be brief. Just that James Goodall, who is the attorney for the New York Times back in Pentagon Papers days, is the first one to recognise. He said very crisply and firmly, this is a global problem. And with that in mind, just briefly, the Bundestag, the German parliament, has a cross-party group of Assange supporters. 29 cities, whenever they can, in Germany hold vigils for Julian. The United Kingdom Parliament has a group of 21 cross-party, and they'll be this week sometime going to stand outside the Belmarsh prison insisting that parliamentarians are able to go and interview Julian. The government has so far, for going on 3 years, refusing. In Australia, there's a cross-party group. There's 227 parliamentarians of both houses together in Australia. There's 26 formally in the Assange support group, and it includes the current Deputy Prime Minister. In France, the same situation, the cross-party group in their parliament. In Spain, the same, only much larger in Spain. So in Italy, we did a interview into Italy just 2 days ago into the Defence Committee. Italy has been very helpful in getting the Council of Europe to make a declaration of support for Julian, a declaration of support for journalists generally. The Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe equally made a declaration of support. The Austrian Foreign Affairs Department made a declaration of support. The Swiss Canton of Geneva offered Julian a humanitarian visa to be taken up whenever he wished to, so that they have specialist hospitals there where he could go and recover from the psychological torture. So you see, it's Lula, the president of Brazil, greets me as a friend in Geneva and said, let me know if I can help. Dilma Rousseff sends me a message, I'm an ally, you can count on me. Obrador, the president of Mexico, makes very firm declaration of support. So we're not by ourselves, it's a worldwide phenomenon, and don't feel alone in this, because it's a massive movement.
Just as a prelude to our call to action, I learned an hour ago that Julian's birthday is July 3rd.
Yes.
Is that right, John?
Yes.
How old will he be?
50.
50?
Yes.
Nice round number.
Yeah, 50.
Well, I think all of us should give Julian Assange an Independence Day gift on July 3rd. As these gentlemen go to Washington, and we'll hear further from Sharon what we can do, we really should target releasing Julian Assange by his birthday on July 3rd. That would be the minimum we could do if we're going to give any meaning to American Independence Day, and no figure best remembered than Frederick Douglass questioned Independence Day, but this would be a step forward in the American Independence Day to have released Julian Assange by that day.
So thank you for being with us. This event was organized by the Assange Defense Committee. One of the things you can do, oh, by the way, we are a project of the Courage Foundation. And so one of the things that you can do is go to the Assange Defense, that's ASSANGEDEFENSE.org, and there are plenty of opportunities there to get involved. In addition, for our in-person events, we handed out postcards. And I don't know if anybody can get a close-up of this, but I can read what it says. These postcards are written to Attorney General Merrick Garland, U.S. Department of Justice, 950 Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest, Washington, D.C., 20530-001. And all we're asking of Attorney General Merrick Garland is to drop the extradition charges. Exposing crimes isn't a crime. Drop the charges against Julian Assange. Thank you for joining us.
Great job. Brilliant. Really cool.
Is that all right? Yeah.
So the third at Echo
Robert,
Park
we're
from
off
noon
live.
Yes, we are.
Okay.
The third at Echo Park from noon to 2, we're having an event for Julian's birthday. Everybody's invited.
Hey, good.
Flyers out tonight.
Great.
We would have had it earlier, but then we were a little busy.
Have you all sitting?
Noon.
I think they have a question back here.
Sure. Thank you.
You want to roll on the questions? I'm still rolling for us.
Okay.
So hold on a second.
Did you get a question?
Oh, sure. Let me look at you mentioned the various politicians and parties that are that support Julian Assange from outside of this country, but apparently in this country, the Democratic Party, which pretends to be, one based on democratic principles, doesn't seem to support the cause of Julian Assange and what it says for freedom of press. And I'm a president of a local Democratic club here, Field of Vern Democratic Club, based on Bernie Sanders. And we put a resolution out to the Democratic Party in April at the convention to the California state, and they shot it down. So I represent the left of the political party, but I'm also a delegate within the LA County Party and the state party, and they do not want to have anything to do with this. So what I wanted to know was, is there anything that you can tell Democratic Party leaders that are more interested in, and basically how they can reconcile their apparent disdain for one of their boogeymen, Julian Assange, for what they think was aiding the popularity of Trump. What can they do if they really actually care about basic democratic principles like freedom of speech that supposedly this country is founded on?
And are you directing this question to anyone in particular, or can any? Well, if it's okay with you guys, I'd like to take a stab at it, since there was for a long while, I was an elected representative of the Progressive Caucus of the California State Democratic Party. That was long ago, and am no longer affiliated with them, but I will say that Bernie Sanders has taken a position on this. You are a Bernie person. When you look at the party itself, all I can say is if you want change, it comes from the grassroots. And so we know what Bernie Sanders stands for. He's not the only one. They're the squad. What I encourage people to do, write to Attorney General Merrick Garland. Also, write to your congressional representatives, your state representatives. And that's pretty much the only way you're going to get change. You've got to organize for change. You can't just rely on the party to take a position on this.
If I can add that, unfortunately, like every human organization, the Democratic Party is prone to hypocrisy. And when Julian Assange was an equal opportunity exposer and chose to release information about the Democratic National Committee, and people have speculated and tried to excuse Hillary Clinton's defeat and laying her failure to campaign in key states at the feet of Julian Assange, as if he was the problem. There are many, when I speak to some of my Democratic friends, who wince when they hear that I vigilantly defend Julian Assange, because they continue to perpetuate the myth, and they even are blind to the notion that if you're going to really believe that there's one road to freedom, which is knowledge, then all knowledge has to be taken, all knowledge has to be digested, and the chips will fall where they may. And that's what Julian Assange has believed in. It would be a credit to recognize that Julian Assange is not playing politics, is not favoring one political party over another, or one country over another, or one ideology over another. So I think the Democratic Party has a lot to learn when it comes to living up to its own principles. Julian Assange would be such an important step forward for this Department of Justice, this administration, and elected officials in California and in all the states and cities that these gentlemen have visited. There is a tragic, shameful silence across the political spectrum in the United States, and I hope anyone on the Democratic Party that listens to Amy Goodman, and anyone in the Republican Party that listens to Tucker Carlson should take their cue and begin to speak up in favor of Julian Assange.
I think it's important to keep in mind that the reason that Julian Assange is being prosecuted is for what he did in 2010 and 2011, which was to, he and WikiLeaks, publish evidence of U.S. war crimes. People don't know that. They don't understand that, and they get sidetracked by these other issues. And so it is incumbent upon us to educate people, as you said, people in the Democratic Party, other people, that that is what he is being indicted for. That is what he is facing 175 years for, is revealing evidence of war crimes in 2010 and 2011. Period. Full stop.
Thank you.
Since we're in a room with journalists, I have seen an attacks of accusations of being funded by the Russian government, being funded by Assad, being, agents of Kremlin or China. As a journalist, this has been incoming attacks on a lot of us here right now in this room, I'm sure. And so and this is to the defense or the family, with the advent of the technocratic takeover too, with the social media giants and Google and YouTube censoring us from reporting what is the truth in a way that is, like Julian, non-biased, and holding both sides of the aisle and all sides accountable. What do you suggest journalists do when they want to speak the truth but they're afraid of the backlash? There is a lot of fear among independent media because of all of this happening to us, and I think more journalists would actually have the integrity to actually speak out if they actually felt that they had resources and they had support.
You want me to answer that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we've been at this for 3 years now. This is the 5th tour. When we first started back in Canberra 3 years ago, I just dragged a barrister friend up to Canberra who's got a lot of bonhomie, and we went around to the parliamentarians and we managed to get 2 on board. 3 years later, here we are. Worldwide movement. I just think to rely upon gigantic organisations that have a particular ideology and are associated, an embrace with the government, like Google and Facebook. Facebook is capped now at $1 trillion. It's so valuable to the government and to other people, that you just can't go there. You can't go, and you can't expect anything from them, and I don't expect. In fact, I aver the media, and I get, you know, Gabriel and Julian and everybody says I'm a bit silly, but and that phenomenon I first saw with Beppe Grillo and the 5 Star movement. He's had this very clever computer AI expert, Roberto Casaleggio. He's dead now, but they averred the media, held meetings like this, said their bit, and Pepe Grillo's a humorist, so he could put in a bit of fun, and they averred the media and used what facilities in social media there are and they could get hold of. They built in a couple of years from 2% support to 27.5% support and moved into government. So that's, take no notice of them. I don't take any notice. I don't rail against Facebook. I know the phenomenon is, if you read some of the cables from Tunisia, the Tunisian government had open source, and the ambassador, the United States ambassador, went to the leader, Ben Ali. He said, look, if you want to be close friends with the United States and we'll look after you and we'll be a friendly association, you'll change from open source to Microsoft. These organisations are integral to, you know, the empire that the United States is. I don't expect anything from them. Everything that was in Germany, we built with Sevim Dagdalen, who's a member of parliament. She's on the left. However, she's a practical parliamentarian and knows that to get support, you follow the centre line, because that's where power is. If you want to solve a problem, you get both sides together. Yeah. If you want to begin a new ideology, well, you buy yourself. But in our case, in Gabriel and my case, we want to solve a particular problem, and for that we need to move carefully along the centre line, wear a tie, be polite. Is that a helpful answer, I hope?
Yes.
Ruth had a question.
Yes, prior to when the Barack Obama administration, in retaliation for the presentation of collateral murder and in retaliation for Julian's telling the truth, or publishing the truth, prior to when it got the Swedish government to investigate them, did it ever occur to you or to your knowledge to Julian that the U.S. government would go so far in violating the U.S. Constitution and the First Amendment?
Oh, well, you know, I spoke to Julian back then, and a thought occurred to me that these people will shoot you, but I'm not going to tell a child of mine that what you're doing will get you shot or get you pushed off a bridge, particularly when he's taking on a vocation, you know, I try to elevate it a little bit, when he's taking on a principled vocation. You know, not any vocation. I'm not going to say it's not going to work, or, you know, don't do that, or, you know, come home, have a cup of tea, get a job in the post office. It's not on. So you just, you mind your P's and Q's and keep your mouth shut and keep your fears to yourself. And if I may say so, Gabrielle, who's nearly 40 now, and Julian, who's nearly 50, and my daughter, who's nearly is 6, I think. Never, ever, any of them have complained to me. Not once, even though I know Gabriel's had his problems, and Julian has tremendous problems, but he doesn't ring me up and say, oh, you know, can you get me out of this? Oh, you know, no, never, not once, not once. So that strength of spirit, you know, gathers together Gabrielle and Julian and myself and a little girl. That strength of spirit holds us together despite what may eventually happen. In spite of what may eventually happen, we will transcend through spirit.
Mm.
I would like to amplify something that John said, that this is not a movement of governments, although governments are part of it. This is a movement that's coming from the people up. And if we wish to make a difference, there are all the actions that we can take. But one of the things that is excellent on the AssangeDefense.org site is an answer to all the lies, calumny, and vilification against Julian Assange. I've had people spit in my face who are good Democrats that I would even consider defending this man. But each and every one of those accusations that have been presented against Julian Assange, there is a bullet point listing of them and shows them to be utter fabrications, lies, and absolutely untrue, and that it is incumbent on people everywhere to raise their own consciousness, to educate themselves, and to be able, when someone says, Julian Assange is a stooge of Russia, Julian Assange is a rapist, Julian Assange is in cahoots with Trump, is in cahoots with Putin, there are definite answers which will put a hole in every one of those. Please educate yourself and help educate the rest of America and the rest of the world.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
I think a lot of people would think that Julian's work.
Could you just make this the last question?
Yeah.
Step in and make it a little louder so we can pick it up.
Okay, I would just assume that Julian would want his work to be continued on, that somebody would want to, he wants him to pick up the torch and run with it. Would you still recommend WikiLeaks as a viable source for members of the press to bring information from whistleblowers who want to point out the crimes of the government?
Well, again, the answer's a bit complex. It's a big question. WikiLeaks holds a library of the diplomatic cables stretching back to the Kissinger era, all in searchable form. It's a fabulous library. A retired Department of Foreign Affairs official that I was having morning tea with in Canberra said, don't tell anybody, but we use that facility. So that's one. The second is to establish how a war is from the inside. The Iraq war files and the Afghan war files historically allow that, to understand what contemporary warfare is like and its furious destruction. It's filthy, modern warfare. It really is. You see in the Russian assistance to Syria against the jihadis and Al-Qaeda and Tahrir al-Sham and all of them. So few prisoners. Modern warfare is horrendous. One salvo from one of those rocket things you see going off will destroy everything in 800 square meters. That's modern warfare. So it's really essential for those that get hold of the information to make it available somewhere.
Well, thank you, everyone. The Shiptons have been in 15 cities in less than 15 days, so they are pretty tired. So that concludes our program.
Thank you.